Also in Ottawa today, be it rushing to rescue stranded passengers or stranding passengers on idle planes, the airlines are facing Ottawa's demand to clean up their act. The Passenger Bill of Rights continued hearings today with airlines facing off against passenger advocates.
The reason we specifically did this is because by giving the mandate to the CTA, which has the expertise because it deals with passenger complaints, we will come up with a set of regulations. I've been saying this since the beginning. By having regulations, you have the flexibility, much greater flexibility, of making adjustments to it in the future in case you want to adjust that Charter of Rights, instead of having to come back with a new piece of legislation if you put it in legislation, which is a much more onerous process.
All right, joining me now, Air Transat's Senior Director of Government and Industry Affairs, George Petsikas. Welcome to the show, George. Nice to have you with us.
Now, thanks for having me on.
I don't want to drag out a sad memory, but, you know, Air Transat kept passengers on board for like 6 hours on Ottawa tarmac just in July. Emergency vehicles were called. And you know, I know it was an unfortunate situation, but isn't that Exhibit A for why we need a Passenger Bill of Rights?
Well, look, I mean, we've been in the media on that one for quite a while now, and I think what I'm just going to say, other than what's already been said, is that obviously it was a very regrettable incident. Obviously we apologize to our passengers for what happened, but it's also, I think, a cautionary tale, and one that can inform the legislative process that we are currently in, and that the Government of Canada has introduced with their Bill C-49. One of the cautionary tales is the fact that this is a system. An airplane, when it flies in the air, piece of metal at 600 miles an hour, 35,000 feet. That's a pretty autonomous piece of work right there. The captain and his crew basically have it going, and they control the situation. But once that airplane lands on a piece of pavement somewhere, well, it's a whole new ballgame. It's in a brand new ecosphere with all sorts of players and service providers that have to work together to get passengers where they're going comfortably and efficiently. Now, when things go well, that's great. But when things don't go well and you have major disruptions as a result of weather-related issues like we saw, unfortunately, in Ottawa a month ago or a month and a half ago, well, then we come into challenges. And what we think we need to do going forward is to have some sort of proactive obligations on all the system providers here to work together. We need plans at these airports. And the Airport Authority is the ideally positioned intermediary to work with us. They work with ground handlers, they work with fuelers, they work with NAV Canada, and they have contact with the airlines. And I think they can come up with these emergency plans and better coordinate the services on the ground, which could probably have prevented a lot of the problems we saw in Ottawa a month and a half ago. So this is something that we're going to be sharing with legislators. Yeah,
I mean, is the fact that you could make this a standard expectation useful for both airlines and passengers? The idea, like, look, yeah, I've been stuck on the tarmac for 3 hours. It's going to cost you $300 if you don't let me off the plane now. I mean, and the airline then knows, hey, if we don't do something to get those passengers off, there's a financial penalty for doing it. Isn't that a useful arrangement to have?
Well,
even though it's not your fault necessarily.
Again, I mean, if we look at this sort of conceptually, I don't agree with the premise that we need a financial stick to get these people off the plane.
What do you need then?
We want to get these people going where they're going. We want to get them to their destination as quickly, as efficiently, and safely as possible. That's what we want. I mean, we don't have to be cajoled into that. But the problem is, it's not enough to just put that obligation out there on the airline and then say, well, you know what? Figure it out, you guys. Because as we saw, unfortunately, as we saw at the hearing, and we've worked very openly and very transparently with the CTA public inquiry that you know occurred a few weeks ago. And it's clear. You can't have a situation where all these service providers that are necessary for us to be able to manage this situation and get those passengers off the plane where necessary in these sort of circumstances. Well, they have to be there, and they have to be proactive. And we heard situations like, well, nobody called us. Well, that doesn't work. And what we want to do is have a discussion with legislators, policymakers, and say, guys, this is a system. Everybody's got to be there. Customs, immigration guys, handlers, airport service providers, and of course the airlines. Just putting out penalties there doesn't mean we're getting anywhere faster.
Well, okay. I guess. Do you agree that we need a passenger bill of rights then? Does Air Transat believe that?
Air Transat was one of the first major airlines in this country to publicly welcome the initiative back in May when the minister tabled his bill. We'd be very open about that, and we believe that there's no problem with having a discussion about a balanced compensatory framework that also improves the customer experience where possible. And that's the underlying objective here for everybody. Everybody wants to make this better for the customer.
One thing your airline is concerned about is the idea that they're going to lift the foreign ownership limits to 49%, and you actually argue that this might threaten competition. How?
Well, actually, I'll correct you there. We welcome traffic rights between Canada, the United States, and Europe for airlines such as ourselves, where we can offer new services and new options for our customers. And that's something we look forward to. What our concern is in Bill C-49 has to deal with the airline joint venture provisions. Okay? And that's where we are going to have signaled and will signal our concern before Parliament, because we believe that in a market as concentrated as Canada, in terms of a big player, right, who is involved in a joint venture, I think you know what I'm talking about, it's Air Canada.
Air Canada, yeah.
When you have provisions which, as this does, essentially removes or limits powers of the Competition Commissioner, who is the watchdog for the consumer, removes powers and puts them into the hands of the minister here, who in turn approves these joint ventures on the basis of public interest, well, there are concerns there, especially when these joint ventures in Canada control already 50, 60, in some cases 70% of market share, and we've counted almost 18 or 19 foreign markets that they operate in from Canada, transatlantically, etc.
Wow.
That should be a cause for concern, and we're pointing that out to parliamentarians, and we hope they'll listen to us.
Well, okay. Thank you, George. Appreciate you coming in.
Thank you.
All right, for a different perspective, let's bring in Gabor Lukács. He is the founder of Air Passenger Rights. Joins me in the studio. Welcome to the show. You're not too impressed with this. Why not?
This bill is a deception of the Canadian public.
Why?
This bill serves the airline's interest very much, but very little in terms of the passengers' rights. Hold on, it looks like there's a number of things that they do wrong, and there's a penalty that goes with it, although they haven't done the full, no? If you look at the actual wording of the bill, there's no penalty whatsoever. The current problem is already the lack of enforcement. Canadians already have many rights. You just have to look at the law books. Those rights are not being enforced by the Canadian Transportation Agency, the federal regulator. So what we are doing now is actually doubling the amount of compensation that passengers will not be receiving.
Okay, but I mean, the way I understand it, they're trying to get this bill through. That enshrines that the passenger rights legislation exists.
No, it does not.
And that there's going to be a penalty scheme put in the regulations.
Absolutely not. If you look at the wording, there are no penalties whatsoever. The only item which may carry some compensation for passengers is if a flight is delayed or cancelled for reason other than mechanical, other than weather, which is already a very small set of cases. And this is something which is not comparable at all to the European protection. In which case, in Europe, if your flight is delayed, cancelled, then you are entitled to a fixed amount regardless of what the airline's exact cause is, unless it's really an act of nature, like volcanic ash. That is a good excuse. Anything short of that magnitude, it is the airline's responsibility. It is their aircraft. They have to keep it up, and if it breaks down, it is their problem. They have to compensate you. None of that is happening here. What is happening here is actually a whole theater of pretending that there are new rights. For example, about baggage. Right. Those rights already exist in our law books. If you open the Carriage by Air Act, the Montreal Convention is right there. It already provides compensation up to almost $2,000 if an airline delays, damages, or loses your baggage, at least on international itineraries. Different point on long tarmac delays. The bill actually proposes to double the length of acceptable tarmac delays from the Canadian standard of 90 minutes to 3 hours. That is a step backwards. And with all those provisions, there is nothing in the bill to the effect that if the airline breaks the rules, then they will have to pay. In the US, the Department of Transportation has been doling out fines, at least under the Obama government, to the tunes of hundreds of thousands of dollars per incident. In Canada, the Canadian Transportation Agency's total amount of fines for the past 5 years is less than $1 million.
So what did you tell MPs? You're saying rip it up and start new?
I'm expressing concern about the lack of enforcement, which is the root cause of the problem. We have a regulator, the Canadian Transportation Agency, which has lost its impartiality, has lost its integrity. When you look at the number of enforcement actions, they have been going down by a factor of 4, while the number of complaints have soared by a factor of 4. So while complaints keep soaring, the regulator keeps less and less enforcing the law. That must change. Currently, Canada is a land of no consequences. An airline can do whatever it wants, and the worst consequence is that they are ordered to comply with the rules as written, but no other penalty. So, of course, in that kind of climate, there's no incentive for an airline to comply. They will actually comply on the stairs of the courthouse when a passenger is willing to go through the trouble of suing an airline, and that is not a normal state of affairs. Under a normal regime, airlines should be rushing to compensate you because they should be aware that if they fail to compensate, there will be a much bigger fine. None of that is happening.
Wow. So, well, they're selling it very differently, as you know, so it sounds like we're getting a bit of a snow job here. But anyway, all right, thank you, Gabor. Always a pleasure having you, and thanks for talking to us.
Thank you very much for having me.